Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that, honestly, on the surface, it looks like it belongs in some dusty archive of colonial history.
Yeah, it really
You
does.
see the date, right? 1746. You see the author, Jonathan Edwards. And I think for most people, the immediate mental image you get is this stern guy in a powdered wig standing in a high pulpit and just shouting about spiders and fire.
Right, that's the total caricature, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's just the sinners in the hands of an angry God guy to most people. They just assume he was this angry fire and brimstone preacher who only wanted to scare people into submission.
Exactly. But as I started digging into the source material for today,
Which is pretty heavy stuff.
it is, yeah. It's part one of his massive work, A Treatise on Religious Affections. And I realized that caricature we all have is just completely wrong. I mean, that this isn't a sermon about hell at all.
Not even close.
It reads more like a forensic investigation into the human brain.
Mm.
Honestly, it feels like 18th century neuroscience before neuroscience even existed as a field.
That is actually a perfect way to frame it. Edwards isn't just doing theology here. He is doing deep psychology. He's essentially writing a psychological thriller. And the mystery to be solved is the human soul.
I love that.
Yeah, and the central tension, like the crime scene, if you will, is a question that is honestly just as relevant today for you listening as it was 300 years ago.
And that question is, how do you distinguish between a genuine spiritual experience and just, well, emotional noise?
Right, because when you feel something intense, say a rush of joy during a worship song, or a flood of tears during a movie, or just a sudden sense of peace while you're taking a walk.
Is that God?
Exactly. Is that spiritual reality? Or is it just biology? Is it just a dopamine hit? Is it groupthink?
Or is it literally just that the drummer hit the kick drum at the exact right moment?
Precisely, and that right there is the dust and smoke that Edwards is stepping into. He's trying to give us a framework to actually understand the anatomy of the soul.
So here is our mission for today's deep dive. This is part one of a three-part series we're dedicating to this book because, let's be honest, it is just way too dense to skim.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just breeze through it.
Right. So we're going to explore Edwards' core thesis, which is that true religion isn't just about what you know. It is about what you feel, or actually, more accurately, what you love.
Yeah, love is the operative word there.
So we're going to look at the anatomy of the mind, the engine of human action, and why he argues that if you aren't emotional, you might actually be spiritually dead.
It's a really bold claim, and I think to understand why he's making it, we have to set the scene a bit. We really have to go back to New England in the 1740s, the Great Awakening.
Okay, give us the context. What was the vibe back then?
The vibe was entirely chaotic. I mean, this wasn't just, a few extra people showing up to church on a Sunday morning. This was a massive cultural explosion.
Like a phenomenon.
Totally. You had entire towns just shutting down for revival meetings. You had these itinerant preachers doing open-air sermons to literally thousands of people. And the reactions were visceral.
Visceral how?
People were fainting, people were crying out in absolute terror, others were laughing hysterically in joy. It was just an incredibly high-octane environment.
It sounds kind of like a modern rock concert mixed with, I don't know, a massive group therapy session.
In a way, yeah, it really was. But the thing is, whenever you have that kind of sustained high-octane energy, you inevitably have a crash. And with that crash comes a lot of confusion.
The classic pendulum swing.
Exactly. So you had two distinct camps forming out of this chaos. On one side, you had what they called the enthusiasts. These were the folks who basically chased the high.
The adrenaline junkies of the revival.
Pretty much. They basically argued that if I'm screaming the loudest or if I'm on the floor shaking the most, that means I am the most holy. They essentially equated volume and physical reaction with validity.
And then on the other side,
You had the skeptics. They were called the old lights at the time, and they looked at the barking, the fainting, the general disorder, and they completely recoiled.
they hated it.
They did. They looked at it and said, this is insanity. This isn't God. This is just mass hysteria. So their reaction was to retreat into pure reason. They started arguing that true religion is purely rational, it's stoic, it's about order and solid doctrine, nothing else.
So society was essentially trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because the emotions were messy and unpredictable, they just decided, well, emotions must be inherently bad.
Precisely. And this is exactly where Edwards steps in. He is like the surgeon walking into the middle of a riot.
Yeah, it's a great image.
He looks at the enthusiasts and he says, "You're wrong. Just because you feel something intense doesn't mean it's the Holy Spirit. It could just be you." But then he turns to the skeptics, the rationalists, and says, "But you guys are also dead wrong. Because if you strip away the affections, if you strip away the emotion completely, you don't end up with mature religion. You end up with a corpse."
Wow. And that brings us perfectly to the core doctrine of the entire book. Segment 1, the anatomy of the soul. Edwards just drops this massive thesis statement early on. He says, true religion, in great part, consists in holy affections.
Holy affections. We really need to stop and unpack that word, affections.
Yeah, because in modern English, if I say, I have an affection for you, it sounds really polite. It sounds kind of weak, honestly.
Right. It's like saying, I have a mild fondness for Earl Grey tea.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like something you'd read in a Hallmark card. But Edwards is using it in a very technical, almost mechanical sense, isn't he?
He really is. To understand what an affection is in his world, we have to look at his map of the human mind. He argues that the soul essentially has two main faculties, two distinct ways of operating.
Okay, let's break these down for everyone. Faculty number 1.
Faculty number 1 is the understanding. This is the faculty of perception and speculation. It's the part of your mind that views things, judges facts, and discerns what is true.
So if I'm looking at a painting on a wall, and I say, okay, that is a square canvas, it's painted red, it is exactly 3 feet wide. That's my understanding working. Right.
Exactly right. Think of the understanding as a camera lens. A camera lens doesn't have an opinion about what it's looking at. It doesn't like the picture or hate the picture. It just receives the light. It's a completely neutral observer that processes data.
In modern terms, this reminds me so much of artificial intelligence.
Oh, how so?
Well, an AI can process a billion facts a second, right? It has perfect understanding in the sense of data processing. It knows the dictionary definition of love. It knows the entire history of war. It even knows the chemical composition of a human tear.
That's true. But does the AI actually care about any of it?
No.
Yeah.
It is completely indifferent.
That is the perfect analogy. You could have all the theological data in the world, you could memorize the entire Bible, you could fluently understand the original Greek and Hebrew, but if that is all you have, you are just a very sophisticated camera. You're just a database. That is the understanding.
Wow.
But then there's the second faculty.
The faculty that breaks the neutrality.
Yes. Edwards calls this the inclination or the will.
The will.
This is the faculty that is not indifferent. It is the part of the soul that actually reacts to the data. It likes or it dislikes. It approves or it rejects. It is pleased or displeased. It either draws near to things or it violently pushes them away.
Okay, so sticking with the earlier example, the understanding says, hey, there is a tiger over there.
Yeah.
But the will says, I hate this. I am terrified. I want to run away right now.
Perfect. Yes. The understanding provides the map, but the will chooses the direction you're going to walk. You really cannot be a functioning human being without both. You need to see the world, which is the understanding, and you need to care about what you see, which is the will.
So where do affections actually fit into this two-part system?
Here is his exact definition. Edwards says that affections are simply the more vigorous and sensible exercises of the inclination and will.
Vigorous and sensible. That almost makes it sound like he's talking about volume.
In a very real way, he is. Think of the will as a sliding scale, or like a volume fader on a soundboard. At the bottom, let's say volume level 1 or 2, you have simple, basic preferences.
Like I prefer the blue shirt over the green one.
Right. Or I'd rather sit down than stand up. Those are acts of the will. You are choosing, you are liking something over another, but they are very weak. They barely move the needle of your life.
But if I crank that fader all the way up...
If you slide that fader up to a 10 or an 11, now you have an affection. If liking becomes incredibly intense, it transforms into love. If disliking becomes intense, it transforms into hatred. Preference becomes longing or desperate desire.
That makes so much sense.
And affection isn't some completely separate, irrational virus that just randomly invades your mind. It is simply your will operating at a very high intensity.
I love that framework.
Yeah.
It really demystifies emotion. Because it means emotion isn't the opposite of thinking. It's actually the result of thinking about something that deeply matters to you.
Exactly. It's an intelligent reaction. And Edwards notes this, and this is where he bridges into the physical body. He points out that because we are embodied creatures, when the will hits that high intensity, it physically impacts the body.
This is where the text gets into that weird phrase, animal spirits.
Yeah, we have to forgive the 18th century medical terminology there.
For sure.
They didn't know anything about adrenaline or cortisol or how the sympathetic nervous system worked, so they just called the fluids moving through the body animal spirits. But his core observation is totally spot on. He says that when you love something ferociously or fear something terribly, your physical body reacts, your pulse quickens, your blood temperature actually rises, you feel a distinct sensation in your chest.
Which is exactly why we talk about the heart as the seat of emotion. We say, I love you with all my heart. We don't say, I love you with all my prefrontal cortex.
Right, exactly. Edwards says we use the word heart entirely because of that physical sensation we get in the chest. But he is very, very careful here. He makes a crucial distinction that a lot of people miss. The body is reacting to the soul, but the affection itself is located in the mind.
Wait, so the rapid heartbeat isn't the emotion itself?
No, the rapid heartbeat is just the symptom. The emotion, the affection, is the spiritual act of the will.
Okay, that's huge.
It's massively important because it means that even if you didn't have a physical body, let's say you're an angel or a soul after death waiting for the resurrection, you would still have affections. You would still love God deeply. You would still rejoice. You just wouldn't have the adrenaline rush or the sweaty palms to go with it.
So we have established the anatomy, we have the understanding, which is the camera, and the will, which is the lover or the hater. And affections are just the will screaming at high volume.
Exactly.
Now let's move into segment 2, the engine of human action. Edwards makes a massive claim here about why we do literally anything that we do.
This is the real so what of his entire psychology. Edwards looks at human nature and asks a very fundamental question. What makes a human being move? What gets us up off the couch in the morning?
And his answer is simply affection.
Yes. He argues that we are essentially inactive, completely static, unless we are influenced by some affection, some love, some hatred, some hope, or some fear.
Imagine a person with absolutely zero affections, no desires whatsoever, no fears, no loves.
They would be catatonic.
Yeah.
It would essentially be like a rock. A rock has no affections, and therefore a rock never moves itself. Edwards says, take away all love and hatred, all hope and fear, and the world would be, in a great measure, motionless and dead.
He uses some really great, vivid examples to illustrate this in the text. He talks about the covetous man, the guy who is just obsessed with money.
Right. Think of the modern equivalent, like the Wolf of Wall Street types. Why do those guys work 100 hours a week? Why do they willingly endure all that stress? Why do they risk going to federal prison? Is it because their understanding tells them it is the logical, healthy thing to do?
Definitely not. Logic would probably tell them to relax, get a hobby, and enjoy life.
Right. They do it because they have a burning affection for wealth. They love it. Or take the ambitious man who's seeking glory in politics, or the elite athlete training for the Olympics, torturing their body every day. The world is in continual commotion, as Edwards puts it. People are building massive cities, fighting brutal wars, crossing oceans. Why? Because they want things. They love things. The engine of all human history is affection.
So if affections are what drive all human action in the secular world, Edwards applies this directly to religion and says, well, why would religion be any different?
That is his linchpin argument right there. If you are going to engage in the business of religion, which involves really hard things like prayer, fighting your own sin, loving your neighbor even when they're difficult, seeking God, you are going to need the strongest engine possible to keep you going.
Right.
He writes this really striking line. He says, he that has doctrinal knowledge and speculation only without affection never is engaged in the business of religion.
Man, that is a heavy statement. It basically says, you can be a theologian with a PhD, you can write 10 books on dogma, but if you don't actually feel it, you aren't actually doing religion. You are just studying it from the outside.
You're just a spectator. You are standing on the sidelines with a clipboard, analyzing the plays of the game, but you aren't actually on the field getting your jersey dirty. And Edwards goes even further than that. He argues that no one is ever truly changed by cold facts.
I think we all know this intuitively, right?
Yeah.
You can tell a smoker, hey, smoking causes lung cancer. That is an objective fact. Their understanding receives that fact perfectly. But does it make them quit?
Rarely. Not until that fact drops down into the will. It won't change them until they develop a real fear of death, or maybe an overwhelming desire to stay alive, to see their grandkids grow up. Until that affection actually kicks in, the behavior remains exactly the same.
Edwards actually says, never was a natural man engaged earnestly to seek his salvation, while his heart remained unaffected.
Exactly. Things like wrestling in prayer, crying out for wisdom, actively fleeing from a strong temptation. These are intense, violent, difficult actions. You do not do them just because you read a textbook that said it was a good idea. You do them because you are moved. You do them because you are desperate.
So the big takeaway here for you listening is if you want to be truly spiritual, you can't just be intellectual. You have to be visceral.
Visceral is definitely the right word. And Edwards doesn't just rest this argument on pure philosophy or observation. He goes straight to the data. Segment 3 is where he brings in the scriptural evidence. He basically dumps the entire Bible on the table to prove that God doesn't just suggest emotion, he demands it.
Yeah, it's a mandate, not a suggestion at all.
Right. He points out that the Bible commands us to be fervent in spirit. And the original Greek word there literally implies boiling. It implies real physical heat.
It certainly doesn't say be mildly interested in spirit.
No, it doesn't. And just look at the metaphors the Bible constantly uses for the Christian life. Running a race, wrestling, fighting a battle, taking a kingdom by violence. You don't do any of those things casually.
Yeah.
You don't wrestle a bear with moderate interest. You do it with every single ounce of adrenaline and vigor you possess.
Let's actually run through the catalog of holy affections he lists out. Because I think people today often reduce religious emotion to just feeling happy or maybe feeling peaceful. But Edwards paints with a much, much wider palette.
He really does. It is a full spectrum of human experience. He starts the list with fear.
Now, see, usually in modern church circles, we're constantly hearing that fear is bad. You know, perfect love casts out fear.
That is true, but Edwards makes a really helpful distinction between what he calls slavish fear, which is just being terrified of punishment, like a criminal who's scared of the judge, that's slavish fear. But then there is holy fear or awe.
Right.
It's the trembling you feel when you stand right on the edge of the Grand Canyon or when you're outside in the middle of a massive, violent thunderstorm.
It's a sudden realization of your own smallness.
Exactly. He says holy people tremble at God's word. If you really truly see God's majesty for what it is, you don't just politely nod your head. You feel a reverberation in your bones. You feel the heavy weight of it.
And then he talks about hope.
The anchor of the soul. And biblical hope isn't just, oh, I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow or I hope I win the lottery. It is a fierce, aggressive expectation. It is looking forward to something with such intensity and certainty that it actually pulls you through whatever present suffering you're in.
And of course, the big one on the list, love.
The fountain. Edwards calls love the chief affection. And this actually provides a really, really helpful mechanic for understanding how all our emotions work. Edwards argues that if you have true love, all the other emotions just flow from it naturally.
How does that work in practice? Like, how does hatred possibly come from love?
Think about it this way. If you love your child ferociously, what happens when you see someone actively trying to hurt your child?
I instantly get angry. I absolutely hate the threat.
Exactly. Your hatred of the threat is directly proportional to your love for your child.
Yeah.
You literally can't have one without the other. If you didn't hate the attacker, it would objectively mean you didn't really love the child.
Wow. So Edwards argues that holy hatred, hatred of sin, hatred of evil, is just the inevitable shadow of loving God.
Precisely. Apathy toward evil isn't a sign of being chill. It's actually a symptom of a severe lack of love.
That's convicting. What about joy and grief? How do they fit into the fountain of love?
It's the exact same mechanic. Joy is simply love enjoying the presence of the beloved, and grief is simply love missing the beloved when they are absent.
So if I feel incredibly distant from God, and I don't feel any sadness or grief about it,
And you don't truly love him. Think about it. If your spouse went away on a trip for a month and you felt absolutely no absence, no grief at all, that really wouldn't speak very well of your marriage, would it?
ouch. Yeah, that hits way too close to home. So all these emotions, fear, hope, love, hatred, joy, grief, they're all deeply interconnected. They are the actual heartbeat of a living faith.
And to prove this isn't just abstract theory, Edwards moves straight into segment 4, the case studies. He brings in the expert witnesses, the heavy hitters of the Bible, David, Paul, John, and Jesus himself.
This is the argument from example.
Right. His logic here is beautifully simple. If the absolute greatest saints in all of human history were deeply emotional, then who are we to say that maturity means being stoic and detached?
Let's talk about David first. He's literally known as the man after God's own heart.
If you read the songs with an honest eye, David is an absolute emotional roller coaster, and I mean that in the best, most authentic way possible. He is never just fine, he's never just okay. He is either dancing in the streets with wild joy, or he is drowning in his own tears on his bed.
Yeah, I have the text right here. He talks about panting after God, thirsting for him.
My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee. That is highly visceral bodily language. He is desperate. Edwards argues that the Psalms are the literal breathings of a holy heart. If true religion was actually about being calm, collected, and academic, David would be a terrible, terrible example to follow. But God holds him up as the gold standard.
Then we have the Apostle Paul. Now, I have to admit, I usually think of Paul as the intellectual, the heavy theologian, the guy who wrote the incredibly complex logic of the book of Romans. I picture him standing in a quiet lecture hall.
That is such a common misconception. We mistake his intellectual depth for emotional dryness, but Edwards points out that Paul was, quote, swallowed up by ardent love. Just read his letters. He talks constantly about having great heaviness and continual sorrow in his heart for his people. He writes with many tears. He talks about having the bowels of mercy.
Bowels of mercy. I just love that the ancients located the deepest emotion down in the gut.
Well, it makes total sense. That is exactly where you feel it physically when you're incredibly nervous or deeply heartbroken, your stomach drops. Paul was so intense, so driven by affection, that people actually accused him of being crazy. They literally said, Paul, you are beside yourself. You don't get accused of being crazy if you are calmly lecturing on ethics at a podium. You get accused of that when you are on fire.
That's a great point. But the ultimate trump card in this whole argument has to be Jesus Christ.
It has to be. If Jesus is the perfect human, the flawless model of what we are supposed to be, then we absolutely have to look at his emotional life. Was Jesus a Stoic philosopher? Was he emotionally detached from the world?
Definitely not. We see him get fiercely angry, flipping tables in the temple courtyard. We see him openly weeping at the grave of his friend Lazarus.
I see him grieving over the city. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. You can almost hear the crack in his voice when you read it. But the most intense example Edwards brings up, the one that really seals it, is Gethsemane.
The night right before the crucifixion.
Right. Jesus is in the garden praying, and the text specifically says, his soul was exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. He is in such profound agony that he is literally sweating drops of blood. This wasn't a philosopher calmly accepting his fate, like Socrates casually drinking the hemlock. This was a man wrestling with the most intense fear, horror, and sorrow imaginable.
So the logic definitely holds up. If Jesus, who was the perfect man, wept, rejoiced, and felt such burning zeal, then us trying to eliminate emotion from our faith isn't making us more spiritual. It's actually making us less Christ-like.
Precisely. It's essentially an arrogant attempt to be holier than Jesus, which is completely absurd on its face.
Edwards then makes this fascinating pivot in segment 5. He goes from the agony of the Garden of Gethsemane straight up to the throne room of heaven. He uses this philosophical argument about the very nature of the afterlife to seal the deal.
This is honestly one of his most brilliant philosophical moves in the whole book. He starts by defining the physical nature of a hard heart. We hear that phrase all the time in church, right? Don't harden your heart. But what does it actually mean, physically speaking?
Well, a stone is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And a stone obviously doesn't feel anything. You can hit a stone with a steel hammer, and it doesn't flinch or care.
Exactly. A stone is totally insensible. It cannot be moved. So if sin is defined as having a stone heart, then holiness must be the exact opposite. It must be having a heart of flesh.
And flesh is tender. It bruises easily, it bleeds, it is hypersensitive to touch.
Yes. So biologically and spiritually speaking, to be holy is to be highly capable of feeling. It is to be easily impressed and deeply moved by truth.
And then he takes this concept straight to heaven.
The argument goes exactly like this.
Yeah.
He asks, is there true religion in heaven?
Obviously. It's the headquarters of religion.
And are the people in heaven bored? Are they stoic and calm?
No. The Bible describes it as a place of joy unspeakable and pleasures forevermore.
Right. Edwards says the saints in heaven are like a flame of fire. They are absolutely burning with love and exploding with joy constantly.
Now, here is where I imagine the skeptics of his day might push back a bit. They might say, well, sure, Edwards, but that is pure spiritual joy. It's not human affection like we have down here in these bodies.
And Edwards completely anticipates that objection. Remember, he has already laid the groundwork that affections are located in the mind, not just the physical body. He argues that the saints in heaven, whether they are currently disembodied souls waiting for the final resurrection or glorified physical beings, experience the most intense love and joy possible.
So he's essentially saying, to say affections aren't religious is to say heaven itself isn't religious.
Exactly. If you strip away affection, you strip away the very atmosphere of heaven. The love and joy we feel down here on earth when it's genuine are just faint glimmers. They're just the dawning light of what we will experience fully there. They are the exact same stuff, just in a much lower degree right now.
So if we are supposedly preparing for heaven, we should be practicing those affections right now.
Exactly. We should be becoming more like the citizens of that country. We should be learning to speak the native language of the place we are going.
That makes a lot of sense, and it leads perfectly into the practical side of things. Segment 6, the purpose of religious practices. Why do we actually do the things we do in church?
Edwards asks a really simple, profound question here. Why did God design the mechanics of religion the way he did? Take prayer for a prime example. Why do we pray?
Most people would say to tell God what we need.
But God is omniscient. He knows exactly what you need before you even open your mouth to ask. So, strictly speaking, prayer is entirely useless as an information transfer. You aren't giving God any new data he didn't already have.
So why do we do it then?
Edwards says we pray to affect our own hearts. We articulate our deep needs, our hidden sins, and God's glory out loud so that we can feel the weight of them. The physical act of speaking it shapes our will.
Wow, that totally changes the whole vibe of prayer. It's not a transaction at all. It's a transformation.
Exactly. And look at singing. This is the ultimate smoking gun for Edwards' argument. Why does the Bible continually command us to sing? Why use poetry? Why use music at all?
Because it's sketchy.
Well, yes, that helps. But Edwards says it is deliberately because music has a unique, natural tendency to move the affections way more powerfully than plain prose. God wants us to be moved. If he just wanted us to coldly know facts, we would just read strict logical syllogisms to each other in a monotone voice every Sunday.
Like, God is great. Premise A, premise B, conclusion.
Right. It would just be a dry lecture, not worship.
Yeah.
But God gave us melody. He gave us complex harmony. He gave us driving rhythm. He created a whole system designed specifically to bypass our intellectual defenses and hit us right in the feels.
And what about preaching?
This is obviously a big one for Edwards, since he was a preacher. He asks, why not just stay home and read commentaries? Why not just read the Bible silently in your room?
Yeah, why do we need a guy standing up there on a stage shouting or whispering at us for 45 minutes?
Because preaching is specifically meant to take the truth and, in his words, set it home to the heart. A good sermon doesn't just inform you, it strikes you. It makes the truth lively and affecting. It takes the plain black and white data of the text and turns it into a technicolor reality that you can't ignore.
And the sacraments, too, like communion and baptism.
Visible representations. God knows we are physical, sensory creatures. We need to actually see, touch, and taste the truth to really feel its weight. All of these duties, prayer, singing, preaching, the sacraments, they are explicitly engineered by God to stoke the engine of the affections.
So if we try to strip the emotion out of them, to be more rational, we are actually breaking the machinery God built.
We are using the tool entirely wrong. We are basically using a hammer to try and pet a kitten. It just doesn't work, and it misses the point entirely.
Which brings us to the real so what section of the book. Segment 7, Inferences and Warnings. Edward steps back and looks at the current crisis of his day, that dust and smoke of the Great Awakening, and he identifies what he calls a satanic strategy.
This is a really fascinating insight into how spiritual warfare operates. Edwards argues that Satan is an absolute master of the pendulum swing.
Walk us through how this strategy actually works.
So step 1. When a genuine revival starts, Satan tries to push it too far into the extreme. He starts mixing in wildfire, false enthusiasm, outright delusions, people barking like dogs, acting completely chaotic and unhinged.
Just to discredit the whole thing to outsiders.
Exactly. He makes the genuine work of God look completely ridiculous. But then, when sensible people see that chaos, they naturally recoil, they get disgusted, and that right there is step 2.
The inevitable backlash.
The backlash. Satan tricks people into swinging entirely to the opposite extreme. They become cold, they become overly formal, they become deeply suspicious of any emotion whatsoever.
And Edwards says this second trap is just as bad as the first.
He says, light without heat, which is knowledge without love, is just as damned as heat without light, which is raw emotion without any truth. It is a brilliant trap on both sides. And he says Satan has been running this exact playbook since the Garden of Eden. He either builds you up into a frenzy to tear you down, or he just completely freezes you out into dead orthodoxy.
But Edwards doesn't just blame Satan here, does he? He turns the camera right back on us, the believers. And he delivers a pretty stinging rebuke about what he calls our shame.
Yeah, this is the part of the text that really hits hard. Edwards asks a very uncomfortable, probing question. He says, why are we so easily and deeply moved by worldly things, but we remain so completely cold towards spiritual things.
I thought of this exact thing immediately when I read it. Like, I can be at a sports game, and if my team scores a last-minute touchdown, I am jumping up and down, I'm screaming, I'm high-fiving complete strangers next to me, my heart is racing, I am fully 100% affected.
Or think about watching a movie. You watch a tragedy, and you legitimately weep for fictional characters. You watch a tight thriller, and you are literally on the edge of your seat with your jaw clenched. You are deeply engaged.
But then I go to church, or we sit down to read about the brutal crucifixion of Jesus, and I am bored. I'm checking my watch, wondering when lunch is.
Edwards calls this the argument from worthiness. He says, just look at the raw facts. If the gospel is true, if the infinite God really became a mortal man, if he suffered the wrath of hell for you personally, and if he offers you eternal, unfading glory, that is objectively the most affecting, massive reality in the entire universe.
It is infinitely more important than a football game or a movie.
Infinitely. So if you can be wildly moved by the football game, which in the grand scheme is trivial, but you remain heavy and hard and clod-like before the truth of the gospel, that is an intellectual maturity. That is sheer irrationality. That is a fundamental malfunction of the human soul.
Wow. He says we should be ashamed and confounded that we are so cold.
It really exposes the modern lie we tell ourselves when people say, well, I'm just not an emotional person. Edwards would look at you and say, yes, you are. I saw you when you got that big promotion at work. I saw you when your brand new car got a scratch on it. You have plenty of intense emotion for the things you actually love.
Ouch. So the lack of emotion in our religion isn't just a quirky personality type. It's a fundamental lack of value. We don't feel it simply because we don't truly value it.
That is his exact diagnosis. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If your heart isn't engaged there, it's simply because your treasure isn't there.
That is a really tough pill to swallow, but I think it's a necessary one.
It absolutely is. And that is exactly why Edwards is so adamant throughout this text. He isn't trying to make us feel guilty just for the sake of guilt. He is actively trying to wake us up. He wants to drag us out of that spiritual death of quiet indifference.
So let's summarize where we have been today. This is part 1 of our deep dive into religious affections.
Right, so we established the anatomy. The soul has an understanding to see and a will to love or hate. Affections are the vigorous, high-volume exercises of that will. Then we established the engine. Humans simply don't move without affection. A religion without affection is just a dead engine on the side of the road.
Then we look at the evidence. The Bible explicitly commands fear, hope, and love. The absolute greatest saints, David, Paul, John, Jesus, they lived lives of intense, visceral emotion.
Then we looked at the philosophy. Heaven is a place of perfect burning affection, so we really should be practicing for it right now. And finally, we looked at the warning. Don't let the fear of false fire turn you into a frozen iceberg.
It's just such a compelling case. I mean, after reading this, I find it really hard to argue that Christianity is supposed to be this stiff upper lip, purely academic religion.
It is impossible to argue that. True religion is a fire. It's supposed to consume you.
But, and this is a really big, but that sets up the rest of the book.
Circles the cliffhanger.
We have established today that affections are absolutely necessary. You cannot have the gold without the properties of gold. But Edwards freely admits right at the beginning that there is a lot of false gold out there.
Yes, there is. Just because you are crying your eyes out doesn't mean it's the Holy Spirit. Just because you are shouting the loudest doesn't mean you are actually saved. There are false affections.
So how do we actually know the difference? If I feel a huge rush of emotion during a worship song, is that God? Or is that literally just the chord progression and the really good stage lighting?
That is the million-dollar question, and that is exactly what Edwards methodically tackles next.
In our next deep dive, we are going to get into part 2 of this treatise, The Negative Signs. Edwards is going to list out a whole bunch of things that look exactly like spiritual maturity, things that might really impress us and our friends, and he is going to say, nope, that proves absolutely nothing.
It is a brutal, unsparing process of elimination. He is going to completely dismantle a lot of our modern assumptions about what a genuine spiritual experience looks like.
I honestly can't wait. But for today, I want to leave you with that final convicting thought from Edwards. We really should be humbled that we could be so easily excited by a blockbuster movie or a salary bonus, yet remain so incredibly bored by the concept of eternity. What does that actually say about what we truly love?
It's a deeply uncomfortable question, but it's one worth sitting with.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We will see you in part 2.